and Mark is LISC's Senior Policy Director and Advocate for federal policies that support LISC's national priorities, including rural development, affordable housing, community development financial institutions, and equitable transit-oriented development. Before joining LISC, Mark worked as the Policy Director of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Multifamily Housing Programs, and also worked for over 7 years at the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today and for moderating our next session entitled Crafting Constructive Partnerships for Rural America.
Thank you, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, I have the unique pleasure today of introducing both Chad Maisel from the White House and Tony Pipa from the Brookings Institution. We've got a great lineup today, both Chad and myself and Tony, and we've structured our time so that each of us are going to provide remarks while leaving plenty of time for questions. So we encourage you we want to make this as participatory as possible. So encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And you're welcome to ask questions as the presenters give their remarks, and then we'll go ahead and address those really in the second half of today's time together. This conference and our session is really focused on constructive partnerships. And we here at LISC, and I know with our partners, know that we're in a really unique opportunity as we hopefully are coming out of COVID and have seen the need for strong partnerships to further rural development efforts. And we have a unique moment in time right now as Congress is considering additional resources for practitioners. So this would be beyond the money that's just in some ways starting to flow through the American Rescue Plan and money that's already out there from the CARES Act last year. So we're very lucky to have Tony Pipa today from the Brookings Institution to provide remarks on thinking that he and Brookings have done recently on how rural federal assistance programs are organized within the federal government and what needs to be done to really further their impact. And Chad will spend some time speaking on efforts that the administration is currently pushing to increase resources for rural development with Congress and resources that are already available and that are starting to flow or are flowing throughout the federal government agencies. I'm just going to spend a few minutes so all of our partners and stakeholders are aware of the policies that LISC is pushing to support our local partners' affordable housing and community development efforts. So we've got a really great lineup today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tony. So Bisma, if you could please bring up Tony's PowerPoint presentation, that'd be great.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks again for the invitation. Really excited to be here and to engage in this conversation, and looking forward to our session here. And I thought what I'd do, Mark referenced some work that we did and published late last year that looked at the architecture of it within the federal government for supporting community and economic development in rural America. And what I thought is to give a little bit of a current state of where today's federal policy is as it relates to support and resources for rural America. And this chart actually was our attempt to basically follow the financial flows that leave the federal government and make their way to rural America for community and economic development. So on the left, you have the different places within the US government where the funding originates. On the very right, you actually have the originating legislation, what authorized those resources in the first place. And some of it's quite historical, some of it's been around for a long time. And the middle are what we call the rural development objectives. What is it meant to support? Terms of housing, economic development, transportation, education, agriculture, all those different things. And you can see that it's quite a wide array of resources. So on one hand, this is a great thing. This shows sort of a responsiveness, a federal responsiveness, and the importance that the federal government places in supporting community and economic development. On the other hand, it also becomes very complex and fragmented And in fact, it's really a collection of programs more than a coherent policy. And for practitioners and for those who are on the ground in rural communities trying to navigate this, that can be quite challenging, because many of these are specific things that then you're needing to try to package together to be able to meet the needs that are unique to your particular community. But this is spread over 400 federal programs. You can see the stats there. It's actually also 14 congressional committees. So one thing to keep in mind is that this also just doesn't live in one place on the Hill as well, which leads to kind of the complexity and the fragmentation. About a quarter of these programs are specific to rural communities themselves. But even then, we often think of USDA as the central node for that within the US government. And in fact, even for those programs that are specific to rural, USDA makes up a bare majority of those resources. And those resources that are even rural specific come from other places within the federal government, like HHS, like the Department of Transportation, Department of Education, some of the bigger ones in terms of those kinds of resources. And the other key finding that I think was for those where rural communities are in a sense in competition with other kinds of communities to access these resources, there's often eligibility requirements and funding formulas that put them at a disadvantage, especially because you're often looked to achieve quote unquote scale through the kinds of funds that are made available. And when you're talking about absolute numbers, well, less densely populated places are not going to look as good during scoring criteria and other things as other kinds of places. So let's go to the next slide. I think another key thing to keep in mind is that the majority, especially of rural specific programs, the majority of the kind of funding is financing, loans or guaranteed loans, as opposed to grants. And that has implications. That has implications for the flexibility that's being made available. It also has implications for what potential recipients have to have in place and are going to have to continue to have in place over time to take advantage of that. And even when you look at USDA RD and you look at the type of programming, as I said, much of it is very specific to things, and less than 1% goes specifically to community and economic development sort of writ large. So sort of in a more strategic sense. Those kinds of things like capacity building or technical assistance or investments directly in local institutions and staffing and general operations. So we can go to the next slide. And in fact, when you even look across the entire federal government and you look at grants, like the left-hand side is showing the major block grant programs. And then the right-hand side is sort of showing community and regional development, that type of funding. Over time, that has just significantly decreased, especially since the 70s and the 80s, when a lot of these programs were initiated or put together, which again goes to the fact that the kind of flexible, large, substantial investments in place over time have really decreased. And let's go to that final slide. We can switch to the next slide. And so when we think about where to go from here, we came up with both a set of principles that look to try to and see that there's a real opportunity, I think, to modernize federal resources and federal thinking and approach to supporting rural community and economic development. Some of those recommendations on our behalf were like, it would be great to have a coherent national rural strategy so that it's not just a collection of programs, but there's a point of view as to the approach that the federal government's taking. To develop White House leadership that really cuts across all of government. And it's great to have Chad here today and to have the focus through the Domestic Policy Council and other places within the White House of looking at support for rural America. But I think to also modernize that kind of funding would be to increase the number of grants that are available, to look at them being more flexible, competitive, long-term, so that you are also supporting directly local places, local strategies, and investing in the people and institutions that are on the ground that can really make these things happen, and to strengthen sort of the relevant capacity building and technical assistance intermediaries, nonprofits, work that Rural LISC does along with its partners, and to be able to provide the kind of support that can really strengthen the infrastructure and the scaffolding, if you will, that local communities would benefit from in sort of addressing what the needs and opportunities are locally, and the strategies that they think would help them be successful based on their local assets. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to let Chad then pick up what sort of the administration's thinking is around how to approach, given what the current steady state is, because there's lots of new ideas and proposals that are out there. And Mark, to your point, even things that have already been created and approved through the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act. And so look forward to the conversation around that.
Thanks, Tony. That was great. That really sets the stage for how these programs sit throughout multiple federal agencies. So, Chad, we'd love to hear your perspective from the administration. Welcome.
Sure. And can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Okay, great. Hey, everyone. Good to see you all. My name is Chad Maisel. I'm with the White House Domestic Policy Council. Good to see all of you. You know, I know we want to allow lots of time for questions, but I'd love to just kind of spend some time at the top, you know, talking through a little bit about our approach, the administration's approach to rural economic development, some of what we've already done and accomplished, which is, you know, I think pretty significant in its own right, and also what the president has put forward in terms of a proactive and ambitious agenda in this space moving forward. Much of it, of course, subject to what happens on the Hill in the next, weeks and beyond. So, listen, I know folks here are savvy in following this stuff very closely. We're very proud of the record of accomplishment up to now with the American Rescue Plan, of course, which passed back in March, and really represented sweeping investments, in the really broadly, of course, but also very in particular delivering impact in rural America. You have things like the expanded child tax credit and earned income tax credit, of course, on the individual side, which, we asked Columbia University to do an analysis, and, they found that the CTC expansion alone will cut rural child poverty by 50%. So just sweeping impacts of these policy changes. Of course, we're now seeking to make those as close to permanent as possible, and certainly to extend those credits moving forward. The ARP, the American Rescue Plan, also made major investments to support community economic development efforts, which I know you all are following closely. The Economic Development Administration currently has $3 billion out on the street with some rapidly approaching deadlines, including the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. And these are, this is significant funding, the likes of which are not often available through the patchwork of programs that Tony highlighted just now. And so we see it as a really important test case for, what can we do if we put significant funds, we send significant funds to regions that have really ambitious and thoughtful visions for their own economic futures, leveraging their assets and the particular opportunities that they face. And, in addition, American Rescue Plan, there's $500 million in the USDA-CF program, around telehealth and access to healthcare. And, this is something that, $500 million, but also really an important test case as we look forward to the Farm Bill, and look to potential expansion in the future. Of course, the American Rescue Plan was kind of step one as we, emerged from the very acute impacts and the acute phase of the pandemic. And now looking forward, of course, there's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then the Build Back Better agenda. So the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which the Senate passed, in bipartisan fashion, overwhelmingly so, just makes massive investments that will have huge impacts in rural America, from public transit, some of which presents some really interesting opportunities for rural areas, passenger rail, highways, clean drinking water, which we know is overwhelmingly a challenge in rural areas, and such a barrier to economic opportunity and economic development. And then broadband, just unprecedented investment in broadband and rural broadband, with the goal of getting to 100% universal and affordable broadband across the country. And so that's the infrastructure bill. Of course, the Build Back Better agenda, which captures some of the American Jobs Plan that wasn't included in the infrastructure bill, plus the President's American Families Plan, and looks at really the individual and family side of things, and also the place side of things. And so when you look at some of the most high impact interventions that we're proposing as it relates to rural America, free community college, 2 years free community college, which we know community colleges are such anchors in rural areas, rural regions. Massive investments in helping lower housing costs and increase the supply of affordable housing through tax credits and government financing, including constructing and rehabilitating, I think, more than 1 million rental housing units. Something that we are really excited about and worked with many folks on this call, I'm sure, and Tony and others, is the Rural Partnership Program, which is $5 billion to empower rural regions with very flexible resources to attract, access, leverage federal, private, philanthropic resources. So, again, the idea is, let's empower these rural areas with flexible resources that allow them to identify their particular needs, their particular opportunities, and really help shape their own future. And so, again, really, really excited about that provision. And then, the list goes on. Many of you all know it. Pre-K, paid family leave, childcare, which is such a challenge in rural areas, and childcare finance, which I know many folks on this call are interested and care a lot about. And then, of course, extending the critical expansions of the refundable tax credits that were included in the American Rescue Plan, notably the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. So we've got it's been a busy few months and a busy few weeks ahead. But just the opportunity for transformational change is kind of at our doorstep, and so appreciate your all's partnership, not only in getting across the finish line, but if and when it does, you all are the ones who are going to make it happen. And as it relates to implementation, you think about Rural Partnership Program, for example, and how absolutely critical enterprises and nonprofits and other groups like you all are going to play, that role you all are going to play in making sure that those funds deliver transformational change for rural places and people. So thanks for having me, and excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Chad. That was great. Good to hear what's going on throughout the federal government.
Yep.
I'm going to spend a few minutes. And so, Bisma, if you could bring up my presentation, that would be great. Just going over what LISC is broadly pushing right now in terms of rural development supports for practitioners and to further partnerships. And then we're going to have, again, a substantial amount of time for questions. So I think we've had a couple come in the Q&A and the chats. We'll get to those. And then don't be shy. I know when we're in person together at our rural seminars, we always have a lot of good participatory back and forth, which is, I think, the highest value of these conversations. So folks may know that last year, now it's hard to remember at times during COVID, but LISC put out a very broad set of policy priorities. And these are kind of our North Star guiding our work from the federal policy team for both 2021 and into next year. These proposals span 17 federal agencies, really reflecting what Tony said, that rural development programs, we have programs that are both rural specific throughout the federal government, and then programs that touch rural communities in different ways, even if they're not specifically targeted for those areas. And this really reflects the comprehensive work being done by LISC, but also most importantly with our partners. We and our partners are supporting affordable housing in rural areas, small businesses, economic development, broadband efforts, which you heard about from Kate, and more around resiliency and recovery due to climate change. So if you have a chance, I'd encourage you to check out our policy priority document, and it gives a good flavor of what we're pushing. Next slide, please. We also developed kind of a call out document that was designed to show specifically, those policy priorities that we think would have the highest impacts in rural communities for both low income people and for distressed rural communities. And these really are in line with the pillars that you heard Kate and others talk about that are guiding Rural LISC's work, which are access to capital, broadband and infrastructure, workforce development, disaster recovery and resiliency, and placemaking. And Chad and Tony both touched on these, and I want to spend a minute on this notion of capacity building. This is one of our highest priorities for LISC and for our Rural LISC partners. We know that as federal spending has gone down over the previous 2 or 3 decades, as Tony has shown, on federal and community economic development programs, that it gets increasingly more difficult for practitioners, especially those serving the highest needs rural communities, often to be able to try to deliver at scale. We don't have a lot of programs that provide flexible resources for rural practitioners to scale their capacity to be able to deliver assistance, sorely needed assistance for community and economic development projects. There are a couple of very small existing programs within the federal government at HUD and USDA, which we've really made some of our highest priority within our team to try to see increased resources from Congress through those 2 programs. We were also very interested as a policy team within LISC on trying to see new programs be structured to provide enterprise level resources for practitioners and not just project specific resources. We want to see resources that go to the nonprofit or other institution administering them, and which allows them to leverage those resources with other private and public funding very easy. But then ultimately after the project done, it's also maybe sits with the institution. So that allows them to do more work over time. So we're rethinking in some ways, is what Tony was saying as well, on how federal assistance is governed. And that's what really makes us so excited about the rural partnership proposal that Congress is currently sitting. You've heard about this. This is, I know a lot of our Rural LISC partners have worked with both the White House and Chad's team and have been doing advocacy with members on the Senate and House Agriculture Committee about this proposal. What's really great about it is it would provide both that upfront capacity building assistance for the full gamut of rural development needs, not prescribed by the federal government, but based on what the market needs and what then the practitioner can provide. So if you haven't had a chance, be happy to talk offline about the Rural Partnership Program, but it would both provide the upfront capacity building assistance to scale the institution, and then financial assistance to help support the actual project. So we're really hopeful that, as Congress continues to debate back and forth the Build Back Better legislation, that this will stick, and we're doing our best with our partners. And thank you all who've participated in those efforts to make sure that Congress hears that message that we need both. We also have other priorities in the Build Back Better legislation that Congress is considering, some of which Chad touched on. We'd love to see an increase in low-income housing tax credit resources. We're trying to really lead the charge with our partners on a new tax credit proposal to help single-family housing in distressed communities where there's an appraisal gap. We think this could be very powerful and finally allow us to have more dedicated resources, which we don't currently have on the affordable home ownership side. And then also, we really want to work with the federal agencies and trying to do so with EDA and others on the dollars already appropriated. So that's really going to be one of our focus areas, especially if Congress can pass additional resources, is to really have a proactive engagement with both the White House, OMB, and the federal agencies administering future dollars to make sure that rural communities are able to access those, especially some of our most distressed places in the country. So we thank you, our rural partners on the call today, and look forward to working with all of you on both money that's already been appropriated for these efforts, and hopefully, like Chad was saying, this opportunity for historic investment in both place and people in the Build Back Better agenda. So I want to now really spend as much time as we can here for our remaining over 35 minutes or so to talk about some of the questions that have come in through the chat. And I see we've got quite a few. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll just kind of open it up to Tony and Chad, and you can decide, Tony and Chad, which ones you want to which ones you want to address, and we can always have you both address questions as well. So the first one that I see is from Pamela. It says, how do you envision capacity sports being deployed? And what organizations will you target for this? And so I think this is a broader question about capacity building resources, and certainly has an overlay with the Rural Partnership Program that's being proposed. So not sure if any of you want to talk about how you see capacity building supports ideally deployed and developed within some of these proposals.
Sure. I'm happy to kick it off. And then, Tony, I know you've done a lot of thinking on this, so I personally would benefit from your thoughts as well. Yeah. So, I mean, we see this as really critical, right? Like, how do we invest in the capacity of rural places and rural communities? That's as really the path to sustainable and inclusive economic development. And so, for example, the Rural Partnership Program, as has been said, allows for funds to be used not just to build things, right? Not just brick and mortar, but also to invest in the people and the organizations that are doing that work, allowing them to hire staff, allowing them to, use those funds to do planning, work on governance, all of these things that we know are central, and work on partnerships. These are all, really critical pieces that go beyond what is often, an eligible use in USDA and other programs, which is much more on the brick and mortar. Tony, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would affirm that for sure. I mean, Mark, one thing just to say about my own experience, I've bounced back and forth between, focus on on economic and community development domestically, but I was actually, when I served in the federal government, I served on the international development side. And I feel like there is a sort of an infrastructure and a scaffolding when we're making investments in places overseas, that we have a wide range of organizations that, are pretty well supported. I mean, obviously no organization would say they have all the resources they need, but there's an approach that says, there's an expertise and a set of skills that an organization working with local partners can really enable and help build capacity and build out the local vision that happens. And I feel like we've got a set of organizations that do that in the United States, especially as it serves rural communities. Some of them are regional, some of them are national, like the work that you all do. But I think it's challenging for those organizations to find the resources to work at the scale that I think we need at this point in time, given where rural America has found itself, especially since 2008, coming out of the recession. And I think the Rural Partnership Program is a huge step forward to actually even just focus, a portion of the grants through the Rural Partnership Program would actually go for capacity building and technical assistance. I think we'd love to see, similar things like through EDA and through other parts of the federal government that also, as you say, touch rural America as well. But I also think that this is a hard one just to put on the backs of the federal government as well. right? Because look, as a federal policymaker, Chad has to go to the Hill and be able to say, you know, sort of what the return on investment is. I think, you know, that can be harder to do when it's not tied directly to some kind of delivery on the ground. And certainly you can do that. But I think this is also where philanthropy could really play a significant role, both through direct grants, but also even thinking about how its impact investments that it's more and more looking to do can be investing in the type of capacity building and technical assistance at the local level. I also think it's a place where there might be room for sort of modernizing our tools on this. And I would look to, for example, EDA's SEDS process, which I think is an important process for bringing all the stakeholders together and getting all of the opportunities on the table for a particular place. I'm sorry, I'm using the acronym, and I should have the what the acronym stands for right at the top of my head, but it's basically the strategic planning process that happens through an economic development district. But then how do we take that to the next level, right? How do we invest in the kind of rigorous thinking that can help those communities prioritize and then understand the kinds of resources that would really unleash the kinds of things that they want to be able to accomplish? Again, I steal a little bit of a page from, you know, my international development experience, and that's kind of what the Millennium Challenge Corporation does through its constraint to growth analysis and other kinds of tools that it makes available to communities that's investing in. So, I think we have, you know, a network of organizations that's waiting to really capture this investment and enable kind of the capacity on the ground that we envision. I think it's a matter of resources, but it's also a matter of partnerships, and it's a matter of also investing in sort of new tools as well that could really help.
That's great. Thanks, Chad and Tony. And that really segues really well into the next question from Stephen in the Q&A about, you know, we talk about IT improvements at the agencies themselves, the federal government, but also about the need to streamline and coordinate regulatory requirements. And I think, you know, one thing that the Build Back Better legislation does is it's, from, you know, what we can see is it's making investments as well in the federal government. So Tony showed how funding has declined to recipients, or just program funding, appropriated money, has declined over decades within this space. But we've also had a concurrent decline in the staffing and expenses and administrative capacity, arguably, of the federal agencies themselves. So of HUD, USDA, Rural Development, and others. And so, you know, from the LISC side, you know, we firmly believe that we need investments both within the federal government to be able to administer, ensure these programs are designed in a way that can leverage the funding that Tony is talking about and that, you know, Chad needs for his discussions with the Hill. And I think one effort that we've really been supportive of and hopeful that the White House and DPC and OMB will restart, for example, is the Rental Policy Working Group. This was an initiative under the Obama administration that tried to align regulatory requirements between the affordable housing programs at USDA, Rural Housing Service, HUD, IRS, specifically the low-income housing tax credits and others, because to Stephen's point, we often see conflicting requirements, for example, on like physical needs assessments or other regulatory practices, with both drive up costs and then diminish the use of the subsidy at times. So I think that's a really good, you know, a really good flag, and I think that's really also a unique opportunity for all of us, for money that's already been appropriated or for potential new money from the Build Back Better, is that we really need to work proactively with the federal agencies to implement these programs in a way that aligns them with existing programs, because as Tony has shown, they're all over the place, and we don't want to see typically new discrete requirements of a federal program if it can adopt the practices of another like federal program to drive down cost and to make it easier for recipients to be able to deploy those funds. So I just, those are the thoughts from the chair's prerogative here at LISC, but wanted to see if Chad or Tony had any thoughts about that as well.
Well, we'll just thank you for that. That was helpful for me, Mark. And I think I would just open the door for, you know, if there are other, you know, examples. You mentioned the Rental Policy Working Group. I think he was involved, and, you know, but if there are other kind of case studies where that you'd either want to dust off from a previous administration, or if there are other, you know, policy areas that would benefit from that kind of coordination and untangling, et cetera. And, you're right. It is a real area of interest and focus at our Office of Management and Budget and Domestic Policy Council. Making sure that the programs that are out there are actually working, right, to deliver on the kinds of outcomes we all want to see. So, welcome feedback or thoughts, not just today, but moving forward.
And Mark, I think it's a really important point that you put forward, that it's important for us to have the resources, but it's important for those resources to work effectively, right? And we have to do both. We have to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be advocating for those resources, but also for the effective deployment of those resources. And I think I would say that there are multiple levels that need to be aligned on this. I mean, you look at like strike force from the Obama years, and I know there's a commitment to be doing something similar in this administration, and in more coordinated fashion, providing a more coordinated customer service facing position to the field itself from like what federal resources are available. And then I think what Stephen's talking about, there's policy, regulatory, funding requirements that need to be aligned on the back end of that could actually help be more aligned. And I think that also needs to line up sort of with more coherent policy as well. So that's kind of like the practice of deploying the resources. But I think, having sort of a more coherent policy that cuts across the federal government as well. And you could envision, you've got a national rural policy, then you've got the kinds of working groups that the DPC and others are going to help put together, because when you start to lay out that policy, you say, wait, we're conflicting in these areas. We need to work that out. And then that would translate into better coordination and in a customer-facing way on the ground as well, through strike force or strike force-like kinds of efforts where there's more coordination.
That's great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, Tony. I think that's still right on. Like pointing to the policy development side of things, right? Like when you're in implementation mode, sometimes you're limited in terms of, because of statutory requirements or otherwise, and you're limited in terms of what you can do in terms of alignment across agencies, across, congressional committees, et cetera. And so what we really sought to do, and certainly was the idea behind, the Rural Partnership Program, is bring everyone, bring EDA, bring rural development, bring HHS and HRSA, bring all those folks to the table so that, in the policy design stage, so that, so that we can kind of bake in the kind of flexibility and alignment across programs and priorities at the front end.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tony and Chad. And for all the practitioners or others on the webinar today, please follow up. I write a lot of public comment letters to the federal government. We're always looking for input from our practitioner partners. We want to see programs work, and we want to let our friends know in the federal agencies when there are hindrances that they could potentially solve through guidance or rulemaking. So just a plug to reach out to your friendly LISC policy team, specifically me. The next question in the Q&A says, what do you think is needed to encourage more agencies and private sector corporations to consider rural investment strategy? So we've talked about, let's try to align regulatory practices where we can. We need additional resources. I know, Tony, you've done a lot of thinking about regional strategies and others. So just be curious if either of you have a take on that.
Well, and I actually loved, I saw, whether it was in the Q&A or the chat, someone talking about collaboration among communities versus regional. I think that's actually a interesting distinction, and one that we ought to be thinking about. I mean, I don't know, look, sometimes like on a question like that, how do we get people considering a rural investment strategy? I tend to always go to the very top. Like I feel as though we're not going to be healthy as a country, frankly, competitively, competitive economically as we are, if we have sets of communities anywhere that are sort of being underserved or left behind in the way the economy works right now. And so I think it's sort of like a responsibility for all of us to be thinking about how we invest in many different places that aren't accessing the kinds of opportunities that we might think are available. But I also feel like there's a lot of innovation and opportunity in rural America that we're not uncovering to the extent to which we might be. And I don't have the answer on how to make that more concrete and more part of the discourse that we're having around development and economic development and prosperity. I sit at a think tank where it starts to get crowded out by, our need to be, where a lot of the economic growth that's happening in the country is coming from 5 or 10 metropolitan areas, and it's, sort of innovation in an agglomeration economy where we've got all the tech sector being grouped together. And I feel as though there's a lot of innovation and a lot of bright spots and a lot of opportunity actually in places across rural America. And we could all use a lot more analysis about what those opportunities are and make them more concrete for investors and others. I feel like, opportunity zones were, for example, a way to try to unleash the market in underserved communities, and is doing that in some places really well, but it's really hard for it to happen in rural places. So how would we rethink those kinds of things to actually meet the specific parameters and opportunities that that rural provides us? Probably some more thinking we should do about it, frankly, at Brookings. But I think there is a lot more opportunity, and I think just doing the economic analysis and sort of collecting those ideas would provide more attraction to outside capital for that.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. One of the attendees asked about, says, Mark, could you give some examples of what LISC policy interests are in the area of disaster response and resiliency? So this is a huge area. You heard from both Lisa and Kate. Obviously, our country is suffering from more disasters every year, and we need funding both for resiliency on the front end and for recovery dollars on the back end, and have those recovery dollars specifically also have some targeting around to make sure that low and moderate income communities are taken into account during the recovery phase. So LISC has helped with a bill that was introduced in Congress that would provide CDFIs more flexible resources as practitioners for both resiliency and recovery efforts. As folks know, especially those that have been in impacted areas, it can take a long time for federal funding to flow from FEMA, SBA, and then HUD, which through the CDBG-DR program really administers the long-term recovery funding. We've been supportive and helped with efforts on the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program through HUD to have that be a codified program and not sit essentially as a set aside within the CDBG program. It sounds a little wonky, but administratively that further delays funds because HUD has to write a new notice for each supplemental appropriations that's provided for that program. And we've also been very supportive of legislations that would tighten the screws a little bit to make sure that those dollars on the recovery side are really highly targeted and proportional need to low and moderate income people, because that's not always been the case historically. On the front end, we don't have a lot of resiliency funding. Our main source is the FEMA BRIC program, the Building Resiliency and Infrastructure Communities. Hopefully I got that acronym right, program. There are some additional resources in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's currently pending in Congress that would provide an additional $1 billion through the FEMA BRIC program for resiliency efforts, which we wholeheartedly support. There was a one-time big infusion of what they called CDBG mitigation funds from a few years ago. But we really need as a country, obviously, to scale the resources on the front end and make sure that low and moderate income communities are not lost within that resource allocation. So we're really excited about the potential in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And we're really excited as well on the administration's laser focus on climate. And we know that that is a priority area as conversations continue on the Hill with the Build Back Better legislation. So, we are trying to advocate as much as we can. We are involved as an institution, both with providing financial assistance and grants and training and technical assistance around these areas. And I'm not sure if Tony or Chad want to say anything more about disaster response resiliency. No? Okay. we'll go ahead to the next one. These are all great questions, so we will get through as many as we can here. And if there are ones that are outstanding, we'll figure out a way to follow up. It says from DM Jeff, what kind of a funding strategy would you suggest for a rural community that has a low literacy rate and doesn't have any businesses to partnership with? I would like to see something that would encourage businesses to invest in these areas, even though it involved a certain amount of risk taking. I'm not sure if either of you have a comment on that.
Well, I can start, and Johnny may have thoughts as well, and maybe from the international context too. Yeah, so I think our thinking, and it's funny, it's like I wish almost this was just a in-person, we were all kind of sitting around in a circle and we could talk, because I think the people on this call would have a great answer to this, and including some real success stories. But as it relates to the big kind of legislative packages that we've pushed up to now, we've really, as it relates to this question, we really thought about it like, okay, what are the big kind of foundational components that every community needs to be successful, to be able to, not just attract businesses, but be places where people and families want to stay and raise their families. And so, obviously, the American Families Plan touches on that a lot, in terms of investment in early childhood, childcare, and pre-K, massive investments in K-12 and community colleges. These are all these kind of educational and workforce investments that we know, are evidence-based, of course, and are like so fundamental. And then there's the kind of infrastructural foundation that we know is important, right? Like you're going to have a tough time bringing businesses in if there's no access to healthcare, if there's no clean drinking water, if there's no fast internet. And so that's the kind of the infrastructure piece of the hard infrastructure piece of things. And so that's kind of part one, I would say, a big part one. And, and then the second is, which we've sought to do through the Rural Partnership Program is kind of investment in kind of the organizations and capacity, and how do we, in my experience in working with rural places and rural regions, the ones who are doing the most exciting things are the ones where, probably where you all are, right? Where there's like leaders and organizational capacity, and they're pulling people together and driving partnerships. And how do we invest in that in the places that have it, and also the places that don't, so that they can take the assets that, identify the assets they have, develop a plan, and then go about implementing it.
That's great. Thanks, Chad. Tony, anything from you?
Yeah, I think one thing, and this is actually a tension, especially in the era of money coming out through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, which is in some respects framed as relief money, and urgently needed, and looking for sort of results quickly. I think we have to be honest about the time frame that it might take certain communities to be able to grow in their capacity and develop over time, right? And that's a tension, because at least the monies that have already been approved have come out and are looking, they're using sort of existing mechanisms, and they're going to be asked. I mean, I think congressional members will start asking, what are our results? And they're going to look for results fairly quickly. So I think one piece of advice I would even just say off of the question is, let's be honest about what it's going to take and the time frame that that's going to unfold in, and develop a funding strategy that's reasonable around those things. But as Chad mentioned, even how we think about this on the international context, I would basically echo some of what he said. What are the key elements that your community needs? What are the key components that your community needs to have in place to be able to then build on and continue to go forward to build more prosperity? And that might be, strengthening up some workforce development in conjunction with whatever educational institutions are local. It might be creating a little bit of an internal entrepreneurial ecosystem, or even just sort of business incubation. It might be, some sort of public-private financing that can entice businesses to come and make some investment because of the concessions that they might be able to get in investing in that particular place. But I think sort of having a vision of how you think that will occur and the time frame it's going to need to be able to build a capacity and occur in, I think are key starting points actually to start to build the funding strategy that you might need.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Chad. That's a great response. We've got a little over 10 minutes, so I'm going to start going a little quicker here. It says, what should be a sweeping vision for rural that would be a guiding star? And I think we've touched upon this in different ways throughout this conversation today. And I know what I'm hearing is we need capacity building resources, both specific capacity building programs and capacity building resources baked in to federal programs to be able to scale the institutions administering these dollars. And as Tony is saying, over time, to deploy that. So that's also just, again, another plug and opportunity for all of us as federal agencies receive more funding to advocate where they have authority to be able to use some of those funds for that purpose. Also hearing, we need general alignment. So we generally discuss that it can be a little difficult. We have to layer multiple capital subsidies for projects, and they're not always aligned, the requirements between agencies. And we're lucky that we have an administration that's really focused on that sort of alignment and advocating for additional resources such as the Rural Partnership Program. Any other thoughts though, Chad or Tony, about what we need outside of what we've already talked about?
I would say connectivity, and that can be both, that can be broadband, that can be other infrastructure as well. Equity and racial equity. One thing we haven't touched much on is how diverse rural America is, both demographically and economically. And we should be understanding that there's actually a racial equity agenda that fits for rural America, and that should be something that should be part of that vision. And then I just think, and I'll just put it under the rubric of local ownership, investing local. So local people own their own solutions, but also supporting local business, local job creation, thinking about building from the bottom up rather than also bringing in something from the outside based on the human, the financial, and the natural assets that might be in a community.
That's great, Tony. And Chad, I'm hoping you could speak a little bit to how you see racial equity fitting into both current and future efforts. And we know the administration has put out some language for the agencies on that.
Yeah, thanks. And Tony, appreciate you prompting that. So, first day in office, day one, President Biden issued an executive order around equity, and really directed every federal agency to take a good look at how they can reduce barriers and increase opportunity for quote unquote underserved communities. And really, we defined underserved communities very broadly. So, certainly racial equity and, community people and communities of color, but also rural, also communities that have experienced persistent poverty, people with disabilities. And so really, the team that I sit on at the Domestic Policy Council is called the Racial Justice and Equity Team. And we're really charged with working, hand in hand with all of these agencies and really pushing them on ambition and thinking through, okay, what are the highest impact interventions that we can, contemplate and implement to ensure that programs are being designed and delivered equitably. And so, as we think about, and maybe I'll kind of tie in a question that I see that Suzanne sent along on the Rural Partnership Program, because I think it's a good example. When we were thinking about Rural Partnership Program, it's, so often in the context of rural, and you all know very well, with competitive grant programs, how do we ensure that the people in places that need the help the most are able to, actually be successful in a competitive grant environment in a competition. And so, consistent with the priorities and themes of the equity EO, what we worked on the Hill with, was okay, like, it's a competitive program, but let's really prioritize the most distressed communities. And we see that as like a hugely important feature of the current design. To answer another part of Suzanne's question, in the more urban areas, the rural partnership program really includes a couple different priorities. First around most distressed communities, which we see as really, really important, making sure that the state directors and rural development are really like going out into these places and helping them fill out applications and hopefully be successful. And then the second is, which is really a priority of a lot of folks on the Hill, is really investing in micropolitan statistical areas and these regions that have community anchors, larger community anchors between 10 and 50K people. And so that's all to say, there's a reason why it was one of his first actions in office, and the equity executive order, it cuts across everything we do. And it's something that, I and many of my colleagues are working every day to implement.
That's great. Thanks, Chad. And thanks for touching on that question from Suzanne. I just, again, to plug, where law doesn't prescribe, we also have an opportunity, if money is appropriated, to influence the agencies, right? So if we see programs that come out in future COVID recovery bills, I think it's really incumbent on all of us and on the call today to chime in with those agencies. We know that the administration put out that executive order on racial equity. We know there's an environmental justice executive order that's directing and adding more and more covered programs, that 40% of those funds go to highly distressed communities. Obviously, there are overlays there for these are very low-income communities. These are often communities of color. And LISC is fully supportive of targeting funds to the most distressed rural communities. So let's all keep that in mind. And if you're interested in any of those kind of future efforts or what we're doing here on the policy team, happy to chat more. I think that's a great conversation. We did get a couple questions just really quickly I want to address about what LISC is doing with the federal government to help create jobs in rural areas and our work with Native communities. We are trying to scale our work with Native communities. We have worked with the 502 Direct, the delegated loan program that they've set up on a pilot basis through USDA to try to facilitate the flow of those 502 Direct loans for affordable home ownership in Native communities that have a lot of struggles with mortgage access because of trust land issues regarding collateral. And LISC is highly focused, as you heard from both Kate and Lisa, our CEO, on expanding our economic development activity. We utilize, just like you all do, federal resources for that work, and would love to see more, and really excited about the EDA money that Chad referenced earlier. So let's just see if we can get a couple more questions in here before we turn it over to the next panel. So we got one here from Stephen. It said, building capacity in rural areas is difficult due to the lack of relevantly skilled employees in the area. There can be low pay, and we generally have to kind of grow our own talent and provide wages commensurate with skills over time. So, just a question for both of you: what potential solutions or opportunities can be developed to address this challenge? About how do we? I think this is more kind of a workforce development question. So, if either of you have thoughts on that, that'd be great. Well, I'll do a plug here. And Tony, did you have something you want to say?
I was going to move it off to Chad or you, but.
No, I mean, I can. It sounds like Mark, you might have something, and so glad to hand it to you. I mean, I think this kind of gets at one of the previous questions, which was really kind of how do we invest in our own infrastructure when human infrastructure when there might not be as much. And I really I think that's been a real priority of the infrastructure bill. That how do we invest in things, but in the process bring people along with it, and how do we ensure that when we invest in childcare, that involves a good paying jobs for childcare providers, for example, and so on workforce, similar idea. I talked about community college and some of the other workforce investments that the American Family to Build Back Better agenda includes, and I think a lot of that will depend on implementation, and to ensure that the highest need places and regions are actually able to benefit from those resources. And so that's something we're going to be, continue to work with the Hill on the, on the statutory language, but then, certainly with the agencies when it comes down to implementation.
That's great. Thanks. I wanted to, I know we've got a minute or two, just in the sake of the political moment we're in right now, go down to a question it says it's to Mark and Chad about essentially what can folks do right now with the Rural Partnership Program? What should they do to prepare for eligibility? Who can they connect to for support? So again, this is still just a proposal. It's this language. In the House Ag Committee, there's a lot of discussions going on about the total number, funding levels that will be allocated at the top line, and that will flow to the agencies. I would say from our end, and I'd be curious for Tony and Chad, we are very appreciative of all the rural practitioners who are joining us today, who have done work with both the White House and have worked with us on sending letters to members of Congress. We want to keep up the drumbeat of pressure and advocacy. We do see this as a historic moment in the face of decades of declining funding that Tony told us about. So if you want to do more on the advocacy front, please reach out to me through the LISC team. But Chad and Tony, any thoughts from you all?
I think I would just add to Mark is that, well, yeah, there's still a way to go for it to become reality. And I think in addition to sort of the type of advocacy you talked about, just even sharing stories about the difficulty of accessing federal resources for the kinds of things that you feel like are going to be have most impact in your communities, and how RPP actually represents a shift in that to something that's far more flexible and long-term and give you the on-ramp to be able to go. I think that would be helpful. So I think in terms of eligibility, I think the thing I would say is keep in mind that it's a partnership program, right? So who are the folks that you're working with? What are the collaborations that you're thinking about that could have real impact? But I wouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves yet. And I think it's really important to have the support and to be telling the stories and to showing how different it is in nature to what already exists, how kind of a transformative approach it is, and to really highlight that and affirm that to make sure it does turn from a proposal into a reality.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. Well, I think we're out of time. So I just want to spend a moment here with a big heartfelt thank you to both Chad and Tony for participating in today's discussion. You can see we've got good friends throughout DC within the administration, at think tanks and other organizations, all laser focused on trying to make these resources happen so that we can have an equitable recovery from the impacts of COVID-19. This is a real historic moment. We thank you for your partnership. We welcome your ideas, and we look forward to continuing to part with you from the LISC policy team to make sure that these resources are administered equitably for rural low-income places and people. So thank you very much, and I will turn it back to Nadia and Kate.